You cannot survive a spiritual desert by just protecting yourself, only by looking out for those who may get lost. We learn this from the fact that right at the beginning of the story of the Exodus, we're told that they took Yosef's remains with them. Tchilas parasha saying, the beginning of our parasha. After the pasuk that tells us the route that they took, that they circumvented the Jewish people through the desert, past the Yamsuf. And the Jewish people left armed, weaponized when they left Egypt. State, the next pasuk says, that Moshe Rabbeinu took the bones of Yosef with him. Why? Because he had promised to do so. Because Yosef made them take an oath. That when they would leave Mitzrayim, they would take his remains as well. So the Kli Yakar makes a link between the pasuk that describes them carrying Yosef's remains to the pasuk that says that they left armed when they went out of Mitzrayim. In Yalkut Pasha Zoy, he explains it based on a medrash in this pasuk, which says that as they would travel to the Midbar, there were two containers. Aron Ashchina, there was the ark that had the luchos, V'aron Yosef, and the coffin that had Yosef. So the nations asked, what's the connection between these two containers that they go side by side? So the Yidden answered, the one interred in this coffin kept everything that was described in that box. That Yosef kept all of the instructions of the Aseret Adibros, which are enclosed inside the Aron. But is a masbid dismichas. Based on that, the Kli Yakar explains why these two psukim go hand in hand. Because first it tells us that the Yidden left Mitzrayim with arms. And what were the weapons that they had when they left Mitzrayim? The Aron HaKodesh that used to clear the way for them as they traveled. Following which, the next pasuk says that Moshe took Yosef's remains. To explain, before they got the Torah, before they had the luchos, what then were their weapons? Because Chamushim obviously is as they left Mitzrayim. Eidos is given Aron HaKodesh before they had the Aron. Asdos is Asmis Yosef. So at that point, the weapons they had to protect him was Yosef's remains. Because based on the principle that Yosef kept everything in Torah, therefore having his coffin was like having the engraved Aseret Adibros. That's the first explanation that the Kli Yakar gives. And then after which he gives a second explanation. That this mention of taking Yosef's remains is linked to the earlier pasuk, which was because they took us on a circuitous route that was going to take us to the Yamsuf. Therefore, Moshe was concerned maybe the water is going to prevent us from moving to where we have to get to. In that case, the water will part in Yosef's merit. As the Gemara, or says the Mechilta, tells us that when the pasuk says in Hallel that the sea saw and fled, what did it see? It saw Yosef's remains, and that's the reason it split open. So we have two explanations over here about how Yosef comes into the story. Both of them need an explanation, certainly if you're going to take the simplest view of this pasuk, because in the psukim frir, there are no psukim in this context that tell us that they traveled with the Aron as they went through the Midbar. We're going to only learn that much later on. So if we don't yet know that there's an Aron going with the Yidden through the desert, then we don't yet understand the principle that Yosef's coffin is the temporary replacement for that Aron. And it's not mentioned in any of the psukim in the Torah, even following this story, as Yosef is given b'schus Yosef, that the splitting of the sea had anything to do with Yosef. Yes, it's a medrash, but it's not something which is clear in the psukim. From them is move on, which implies that even though the primary reason why they took Yosef's remains with them is because it was a key part of the deal about Yetzias Mitzrayim, Kashvas Yosef. Because Yosef made them promise, they were just going to take you out of Mitzrayim, and then you've got to take my remains with you. But the fact that this pasuk about taking Yosef is in such close proximity to the story of them going through the Midbar, that implies that in addition to the fact that we have to know they took Yosef's remains to honor his promise, but there's got to be a link to the Halichei Midbar Dafka, to the actual journey into the Midbar. The Derish Bir, which raises the question, what is the link between carrying Yosef's remains and going into the Midbar, besides the two that the Kli Yakar mentions, which are not obvious in the Psukim? Plus, what's it got to do with us? We also have to understand, considering Torah is eternal. Torah contains lessons for all Jews in all places at all times. So in that case, it's moving. This principle of carrying Yosef's remains, as they headed out into the desert, having left Mitzrayim, must have an eternal lesson that applies to all of us at all times in all places. What's the lesson? Plus, bear in mind, this is an eternal message, because in the Ein Moleki Pula from Yikach Moshe Sasmas Yosef, there's a single action that happened once, Moshe Rabbeinu taking Yosef's remains, which is recorded in Torah as a hira or nitzchis, so that one event must have an eternal message for us. What's the message? So to get there, we have to ask a question that should bother us. Let's understand this by first exploring how come, and this should bother us, that the Torah refers to Yosef's bones. Okay, so Yosef, when he administered this oath to them, referred to himself as bones, right? As the pasuk says, when the Eibusha takes you out, take my bones with you. Okay, that's Yosef's prerogative. He's referring to himself. But referring to somebody as bones is not respectful. Therefore, when the Torah now is telling us the story of moving Yosef, shouldn't refer to him as bones. Should have said they took the coffin of Yosef, or just said Yosef. They took Yosef with them. Especially when you consider the first opinion of the Kli Yakar that this is compared to the Aron HaKodesh, then don't use a disparaging term like bones. So why does the Torah say Atzmos Yosef? That's because that's exactly what the Torah wants to emphasize here. That what Moshe took with him when they left Mitzrayim is not just the remains of Yosef, but the bones of Yosef. The reason that bones are called atzomois is a play on the word etzim, because they are, of course, the structure that holds up the whole anatomy of the human being, and therefore represents the core, the essence of what the human being, or you could even use it with reference to animals, like for example we see in the Korban Pesach, ve'etzim le'sish b'ruvoi. Und das mitnehmen Atzmos Yosef ist wirklich neger, weil bei Yosef el Kimon der Hamidbar Kidder Kamon. So therefore the message over here is not just taking the anatomical remains of Yosef, but rather taking the essence of Yosef, and that's critical if you're about to go into a desert, and that's the message that we have to unpack. First question is, what do you mean the essence of Yosef? Was ist Atzmos shel Yosef? What is the unique aspect that distinguishes Yosef from everybody else that would be considered his essence? So the first place to look is in his name, because as we know, a name speaks to the essence of a person. His name is Yosef. How did he get his name? Because Rachel, when he was born, called him Yosef, saying, Yosef havaya li ben acher. May the Eibusha give me another son. Das heißt, in Yonisha Yosef is, that means at the simplest level, Yosef represents as zukommen noch a ben, that another son should enter into the space. Right? Yosef is a son, so Yosef represents that now there should be an addition of another son. But that's not the full story. Das ist aber noch nicht schlimmes Atzmos Yosef. That's not the real essence of Yosef, just that he brings another son into the picture. From demot wollte gedacht stehen, nor Yosef Hashem li ben, because then the pasuk would have just said, Rachel daven, let Hashem give me a son. Let Hashem add a son. But then was Yosef is lemer Yosef Hashem li ben acher, but the fact that she emphasized that the Eibusha add to me another son is moving as das nicht ben stam, no ben acher. That means that the emphasis over here is not just saying a son, but saying an other son. What does that mean? So Chassidus explains, it means as fun acher zomer machen a ben, that Rachel is implying in Yosef's name that the energy is all about taking something which is acher, outside of the fold, distinct from kedusha, and turn that into a ben, which is intimately connected to the Eibusha. In other words, for Naiden velchis an acher, a Jew who is different to what Jews should be. Sein Anhag ist Anhag acheres von Yiddishkeit. He behaves in a way that is foreign to Yiddishkeit. Bis achmon litzan ganzen acher. To the extent that not only does he behave a particular way, but actually the person becomes something which is antithetical to Judaism. She'enei tzaddik kedusha, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, sitra achra, another side means you're not in the space of kedusha. Yosef represents, you take that person that others might have written off and you turn him into a son, somebody with an intimate relationship to the Eibishter. That Jew that somebody may have wanted to write off because his behavior is so antithetical and his persona has become so antithetical to Judaism, the job of a Yosef is turn him into somebody that everybody looks and says, that is the Eibishter's child. Yosef Abayli ben Acher, as the Tzemach Tzedek points out, one of the midrashim on this pasuk, Yosef Abayli ben Acher, is really, really specific. As Acher meant that who is this Acher Rachel was talking about? Somebody who behaved in a way that is totally opposite to Judaism, like Yeravam ben Nevat, who of course we know is considered one of the worst examples of idolatry and getting others to be engaged in idolatry. That's really strange. Why on earth would Rachel be davening, let Hashem give me another son, Acher, a different son, like who? Like Yeravam. Why would she ask for that? A Yiddish mama would never say such a thing. Now, das Gufes appears from Yosef Havayli ben Acher. Yet the Tzemach Tzedek explains that's exactly what Yosef Havayli ben Acher means. As von einem was that the power should be to take even that person who behaves in a way that belongs to other cultures and other nations, other belief systems. So that person should become again the Eibishter's child. Und der Inyan is negea b'mareizken from Mitzrayim und al sachona lezeh. So this concept of taking the Jew who's off the rails and turning him back into the Eibishter's child, that's critical information at this particular point when they're about to leave Mitzrayim. That's how you prepare to leave from Mitzrayim. Was demot bei Tzis Mitzrayim is gale geworden b'chol olam akiyum b'foil of a golif from the monzag shalach es beni. Because the moment of Yetzias Mitzrayim is when the whole world can now recognize that the Eibishter says, send out my child. That's the designation of a Jewish person, the Eibishter's child. As Eden seinem Bonim. That's what a Jew is. And because the Eibishter always treats us in the way that we behave, is by Mareiskim for Mitzrayim, as we leave Mitzrayim, haben Eden durch Moshe Yisrael and Mitzrayim, the Yidden, guided and inspired by Moshe Rabbeinu, who is their guide and shepherd, they had to take with them not just the remains of Yosef, but the essence of Yosef and everything that he stands for. That what does it mean to be a Jew? It means to create another child of the Eibishter's. And that means even taking the Jew who up until this point in time was completely distant and disconnected and turn him into the Eibishter's child. That's why you're leaving Egypt, because we are the Eibishter's children. Therefore we're responsible to ensure that all the Eibishter's children are in fact living like his children, feeling like his children. Now that is at the beginning of the parasha, and it links right in to the message at the end of the parasha. That's why we know that the end is always wedged in the beginning. From Tchilas Parasha Seder Mitzvah, the link between the beginning of Beshalach and the end of Beshalach, which is about Amalek. In Sefer Parasha V'Tetzelt Vayov Amalek V'Ilachem Yisrael B'Refidim. The end of the parasha tells us Amalek attacked the Jewish people in Refidim. Vayom Moshe El Yehoshua B'Chalon Anoshim. So who did Moshe appoint to lead the charge against Amalek? Yehoshua. As Mechama is Gifrid Gifron Al Dei Yehoshua, he's the one who had to lead the war. Why? V'Shteit Midrashim the Tam. Midrashim explained the reason why it had to be that Yehoshua led the campaign against Amalek, Nit durch Moshe rather than Moshe. While Yehoshua is Mizera Yosef, because Yehoshua is a descendant of Yosef, right? It's from Shevet Ephraim. Ochsiv, and the pasuk tells us in Ovadia, that the house of Yaakov will be fire, of which the flame of that fire is Yosef, of Esav lekash, and Esav is the straw that will be burnt by that fire. And Amalek is doch Mezer Esav, so Amalek is the descendant of Esav, and as the Gemara tells us that the only way that Esav could fall is in the hands of a descendant of Yosef. That's why Yehoshua has to be the one to attack Esav, in this case Amalek. The Meglechkeit as Amalek hat gekent Melchama Hotman Mitiden. So now you've got to ask yourself, they didn't have just come out of Mitzrayim. They are being protected by these incredible miracles. How is it even possible that Amalek should attack them? The reason is, it's because the Jews wobbled in their faith. They asked, is the Eibishter really with us? So which Jews were now susceptible to Amalek's attack, vulnerable? Only those who were dragging behind, who were not part of the main body of the Jewish people. Rashi explains, these were people who lost the stamina to keep up with the rest of the nation because they had done Averos, therefore they were expelled by the clouds. Nor indeed, only those who were behind the Jewish people, outside of the cloud, could they be attacked by Amalek. The Jews who were inside the protected environment of the cloud, meaning to say that they had a healthy relationship with Eibusher, Amalek could not touch them. So therefore, Amalek, speaking in the voice of the Yetzer Hara, challenges us, the Jews inside the cloud, and says, listen, I only have an issue, I'm only attacking those Jews who are not really aligned with Judaism. That's why they're not inside the clouds, because they were expelled due to their choices. I'm not bothering you who live as Jewish people inside the community. So why should the Jews who fear sin, who are dedicated to the Eibusher, why should they expose themselves outside of the clouds? As Rashi explains the pasuk that says, "Tzei hilachem," go fight, means go out of the cloud in order to fight against Amalek. Going outside of the cloud exposes you to physical and spiritual dangers. And Amalek says, what, you're going to put yourselves in such peril in order to save those Jews that even the Anan expels them because they obviously don't belong inside the community? So you might actually listen to what Amalek has to say. Therefore, is the Agdama Litzias Mitzrayim Lechemes Amalek. Therefore, the introduction to leaving Mitzrayim, which in turn prepares us to fight Amalek, is Vaikach Moshe Atzmos Yosefim. You got to take the essence of what Yosef stands for. Uva Meila. Pshas kommt am Matzav. As Aid is an Amayid von Achet Sovina Shabashomayim. Therefore, if a situation arises where there's a Jew who is outside of the pale of what Judaism is all about, distant from the Eibusher, he challenges whether or not the Eibusher is real or with us. Or with the Moshe was Rashi brings, as Rashi describes by way of parable, like a father who has his child on his shoulders as he goes on a journey. And somebody passes by, and the child says to the passerby, "Have you seen my father?" So the father says, "What, you don't know where I am?" And he throws him off his shoulders, and immediately a dog comes and bites him, which is the mashal of Amalek. We're talking about the kind of Jew who doesn't recognize or doesn't acknowledge his own father, and therefore behaves in a way which is the opposite of Judaism. So you'd think, what, I should go protect him? At that point, we need strong, God-fearing people who are going to step out of the protection of the cloud, to go save that Jew who has turned his back on the community and bring him back into the community. And as all, he should recognize the Eibusher as his father. Recognize how the Eibusher cares about every Jew as his own child. As Rashi says, I'm always with you and I'm always looking after all your needs. To the extent that everybody can recognize that this person who was outside rebelling is actually the Eibusher's loving child. That's why this war has to be led by Yoshua, a descendant of Yosef. It's no question that the war is directed by Moshe. It's the people who are dedicated to Moshe who are going to fight this war. It's as Moshe's representative. But to choose who's going to fight this war, to find those Jews who are slack in their faith and disconnected, for that you need Yehoshua, who is a descendant of Yosef. Because this war represents what Yosef's service is all about. Yosef Havayali ben Acher, to take that disconnected Jew and turn him back into a child. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu occupied himself with at the time of the Exodus, to make sure that Yosef is embedded into the core psyche of the Jewish people. So that's the war that we have to fight. Now we can also understand the proximity of the pasuk that says Moshe took Yosef's essence, remains, bones. Straight after or shortly after the pasuk that says the fact that the Eibusher took us on a circuitous route through the desert in order to get to Eretz Yisrael. The fact that they had to have Yosef's bones representing the essence of what Yosef is all about with them, that is relevant Ibn wouldn't take of Harain in Eretz Yisrael, because had the Jews gone straight into Eretz Yisrael, was der Welt given a Geula Shlema, which would have brought Mashiach right then and there, wollte man sich nicht genötigt zu sich, if as I feel, and that's what says, we wouldn't have needed Yosef's bones, because it's a quick transition, everything falls into place. But that's not what happened. Because the Eibishter is going to reroute us through the desert. For Mitzrayim, Zayin gegangen in Midbar from Egypt. We go into the Midbar, which is a dangerous place, as the pasuk tells us. Midbar Agadol v'Aner. It's an overwhelming desert, which is full of different dangers. Nochash, Soraf, Yakrov. Different types of snakes and scorpions. Vitzimoin, Asher and thirst because there's no water. The reason that the desert is a physically dangerous place is just a reflection because it's a spiritually dangerous place. Why? Because the Midbar is described as Lo Yeshev Adam Sham, a place that is not for human habitat, or in a deeper way, a place that is not suited to be where Jewish people who are called Adam should settle. In other words, it's spiritually devoid. An Ort, wo es kommt nicht der Adam ha'elyon, auf welcher steht, weil du musst Adam ha'elyon. It's a place where the Adam ha'elyon, the Eibishter's supernal manifestation as expressed on the divine throne, doesn't enter the space. There's no awareness of the Eibishter in this place. Ken dort treffen Ayid, as Ayid soll nicht beistehen in Nissenes, welche sein verantworten. So in such a spiritually devoid place, it's possible that a Jew could land up unable to overcome the challenges of the place. And soll stehen in der Meile der Chelek, Rachmone letzlan. He could, God forbid, become an acher, disconnected from his Judaism. Just look at the history of the 40 years in the desert, how many different challenges the Jews failed over and complained about. That's why at all times we have to have Yosef's bones representing Yosef's essence. We have to be committed to the job of turning the foreign Jew back into a child of the Eibishter. And we're empowered to do so from the moment of to transform those people who are going to falter in that environment and bring them back into the deepest connection to the Eibishter. Und das ist echt die Eira, was man nennt, if kol azmanim v'amekoymes, once we understand the parasha in this context, it's very clear what the lesson is for all times and places. Von dem, was Vaikach Moshe satzmas Yosef imoi, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu ensured that he had the essence of Yosef traveling with the Jewish people. Because the journey of the Jewish people throughout all the travails of our difficult history in Golus is very clearly, and it's written in Torah sources, a journey like the journey going through the desert they went through at that point in time. So the Torah gives us an eternal lesson. If you're going into the Midbar, you're going into Golus, ensure that you have Yosef's essence with you. Keep the focus that if we are in Golus, our primary objective is to find those Yidden who have disconnected from the Yiddishkeit and restore their sense of being the Eibishter's child. Und das ist echt der Scheich zum Zion von der Frieden Pasuk Vachamushim Alu Bnei Yisrael Meretz Mitzrayim, and that's also related to another meaning of that Pasuk Vachamushim, which we translated in Pshat, that they went with weapons, but there's another well-known translation. Was eine von der Pirushim in Vachamushim is, Ve'arov gebracht euch in Pirush Rashi, one of the explanations, Rashi even quotes it is, that only 1/5, 20% of the Jews of that time actually left Mitzrayim, because 80% died out in the plague of darkness because they didn't believe that they would be able to leave. So once you hear that shocking news, then the Torah says, but don't worry, that's what was, what will be, something completely different. Because we're traveling with Yosef's lesson. Because we will consistently keep Yosef's model of how to live first and foremost in our minds. As von jeden Eden was is where we are completely focused that every Jew who is currently in a state of acher, we will turn into a ben. So we can ensure that when Mashiach comes, every single Jew comes out. It will not be a repeat. Chamoshim Olu back then, but we'll ensure that that never happens again. As the Rebbe has told us before more than once, in the Tshuva of the Shalias Ben Rasha, what's the explanation of what the Chazal tell us to put into the Haggadah to respond to the so-called wicked son at the Seder? Had he been there in Mitzrayim, he would never have been redeemed. However, the real meaning is it's only there in Mitzrayim before Matan Torah that a Jew could have been left behind. Aber in die Gula von the Yitzdiken Golus, but when Mashiach takes us out of this Golus, even this Russia who's kicking and screaming and protesting is going to come out of Golus. As the Pasuk says clearly, that the Eibusha comes up with all kinds of plans to ensure that nobody gets completely pushed away. Gebrach Yevorin Psak Din, which is brought in Halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and of course, famously by the Rambam, that B'Sefer Hifticho Torah Sheyisol Oisin Tshuva B'Seif Kolosin Umiyad Hein Negolin, that the Rambam writes in Halacha that it's guaranteed we'll all do Tshuva and we'll for sure come out of the Golas. And das Guf is meir by him. As just that awareness is enough to inspire a person to return to his Yiddishkeit. That Rasha now becomes a Chacham, completely dedicated to the Eibishter. Now, Parshas Beshalach is always in Chodesh Shvat, and as we're about to see, there's a special link between Chodesh Shvat and Yosef. Parshas Beshalach learned ben alamol in Chodesh Shvat. We always learn it in the month of Shvat. Was Chodesh Shvat is verbunden mit Yuchad mit der Avodah von Yosef. Shvat is linked to Yosef. How do we know that? Kiodua, as the Yud Beis, Chod Shashon is connected to Yud Beis Shvatim. The 12 months correspond to the 12 tribes. And the Shvatim can say the Toldois and Kumtois. And if you follow the order, the birth order of the Shvatim, then it turns out as Chodesh Shvat, the 11th Chodesh von Nisan, then Shvat, which is the 11th month after the first month Nisan, is connected to Yosef, corresponds to Yosef, the 11th of the brothers. But it goes deeper than that. The Shaychos von Chodesh Shvat to Yosef Vetman Pashem back to Mamvur in Kabbalah. To understand the real connection between Shvat and Yosef, there's an explanation in Kabbalah that every single month of the year has a different combination of the letters Yud Kei Vav Kei. As in the Yud Beis Chod She'ashon as animated Yud Beis Tziruf Hashem Havaya, through the 12 months, there are the 12 different combinations of the 4 letters of Hashem's name. In Yed Nechedesh is Me'at Tziruf Miyuchud from the Shem Havaya. Each month is a different combination, and that's represented as an acronym for a particular statement or phrase or pasuk in Torah. The tziruf von Shem Havayim Chodesh Shvat is the tziruf was in Rosh Tevis Hamer Yimirenu v'Hayohu. So, the particular combination that is relevant to Shvat is Hey Yud Vav Hey, which is an acronym for the pasuk Hamer Yimirenu. If a person went against halacha and swapped an animal they designated as a korban for a different animal, V'Hayahu, then that animal, and the pasuk continues, and the one he swapped it are now both holy and both have to be brought as korbanos. This is really strange because everything in Torah is absolutely precise. These 4 words, which are chosen to represent the particular combination of the Eibishter's name that is relevant in Pashas, or that radiates in the month of Shvat, from the pasuk, must have a link surely to what the pasuk is telling us. Isn't it moving? So it doesn't make any sense. In pasuk steht doch früher v'lo yemirenu. The context of this pasuk is the Torah telling us, you may not swap an animal once you've already designated it as a korban. It says, alav min Torah. It's a Torah prohibition. And if you transgress that prohibition, you deserve lashes. As it's not as v'imomer, then the Torah says, and if somebody didn't listen and they transgressed and they swapped out the korban for another animal, then is v'hoyus merasi yakodesh. We penalize that person, and now both animals have to be brought as a korban. That sounds like it's really not a positive situation. You didn't listen to the Torah, now you're being penalized. Yet here, Kabbalah is telling us that the combination of the Eibishter's name associated with Shvat is just about the fact that you did make the exchange, and now it becomes designated as holy. As if this is a positive thing. It almost sounds like it's an instruction. If you didn't know the context, what you'd be reading is switch them. That's completely the opposite of the context, which is don't swap your animal. You're not allowed to do this. Now the answer lies in what we've explained till now, that Yosef is all about. Yosef Havayli ben Acher. The Teichen in Atmura B'Avodah Ruchnis is, let's understand the spiritual connotations of this idea of swapping an animal that had been designated as a korban. We're trying to swap one thing for another, meaning, as for davar chel machmen kedusha, we're trying to take an animal that is a regular animal, that is mundane, and turn it into a holy animal, which is a korban. Which is exactly the same principle as taking a person who is in a category of acher, outside of the realm of kedusha, and bringing them in to become a ben, becoming holy. As for acher machmen ben. If a person wants to have that kind of influence over an individual who is so distant from their Judaism, to turn him into the Eibishter's child, meaning in a way that he's conscious of it, you've got to step out into his world. And that's a spiritual step down from your own world, stepping out of the cloud. You're in the holiness of the cloud, surrounded by the space of davening and of learning. That's where your head is. And you've got to go out of the clouds like Yoshua and his soldiers. You've got to be in the place where the acher, the disconnected Jew is. And in that arena, that's where you have to work on him to bring him back into a space of being very much the Eibishter's child. That is the same principle as Tumura. Firstly, the mashpia. I'm the person who's going to have that hopefully positive impact on somebody else. I have to switch out my reality. I'm going to exchange my safe haven for being out there on the streets. But if I do that, then I can switch the reality of the recipient. That he was an acher, instead of being an acher, now he should become a child again. So if a person's going to say, why would I do this? Why do I have to leave my holy environment and go into a space that is exposed to the public and all of their influences? To go searching for some disconnected Jew and then turn him into the Eibishter's child in a way that he's conscious of it. Isn't it better and safer if I stay in a place of holiness? You could argue logically, every morning in my davening, I ask the Eibishter not to test me. So now I'm going to put myself in an environment where I'll test myself. If I daven to the Eibishter to prevent me from having a testing situation, then I certainly may not create a testing situation for myself. So I should stay safe and secure in the daladamas of holiness and leave that Jew to find his own way home. So the Torah says you're right. It's a lav shel Torah. Ordinarily, you should not swap your reality for a different reality. That's if everything is working as it should. But if you become aware of the fact that there's a Jew lost in the desert, the desert that is controlled and influenced by all the nations with their narratives, which means his neshama is in danger. And can you imagine if you're talking about a whole group of Yidden? Then that is the time you have to pause your own learning and your own davening. You've got to go out there to fulfill the greatest mitzvah, which is to save a person who's in danger. So now you're going to say, but I don't want to go there. I'm scared it might harm me. Maybe spiritually I'll be dragged down because of this encounter. So we know the Gemara in Sota, the Mishnah in Sota tells us, that is what you call a crazy chassid. Chassid, because you're trying to be so frum, doing something which is completely contrary to Torah. If you're dealing with a man or a woman or a child, boy or girl, as the Mishnah there says, who's drowning in the river, and certainly if they're in spiritual danger, as we know, that the person who causes somebody else spiritual damage by making them sin is worse than killing them. The Gemara is very clear over there. In that case, you've got to run full speed to rescue that person without starting to worry. Is it sneers? Is it appropriate? It's going to drag me down. Spiritually, it's not. Okay, be careful there. Where you say, is it sneers? That's the example of the person jumping in to save from the river. The Rebbe has very clear guidelines about what we may or may not do in the context of sneers when it comes to shlichus. It's very important to remember that. On Tomam in Tut doesn't need. If we ignore the person who's in danger, so not only is that not the behavior of a chassid, not only is that a person who's a fool, a chassid is not so smart. It's not just that I'm not going beyond the letter of the law. It's against the law. It's against one of the most strict, powerful, important laws in Torah, pikuach nefesh. And if we do what we're supposed to, and we do it correctly again, coming back to the point that there are very clear hiroas in halacha and from the Rebbe how we engage with these people or these situations. When we do go out into the desert to encounter the Jew who's lost, guided by the hiroas of Torah, which means that yes, I am going to step down from my spirituality. I could be investing in myself right now. But at the same time, I don't in any way filter, dilute, or compromise Torah. I don't compromise one iota of halacha. And I certainly don't change the nature of Torah mitzvahs in the name of outreach. No, I'm very clear about that. If I do it properly, then then the same Torah that says v'lo yimirenu, don't swap somebody with somebody else's situation, here promises us, if you have to do this avodah, you and the other will both become holy. Not only will this not harm you, both you and the other Yid, who, when you engaged them, was originally in a state of acher, you're going to be kodesh v'haya. It's a guarantee. It's going to be stable. Let's pay closer attention to the words associated with the name of the Eibishter, which is aligned with Shvat. V'haya hu. Key words over here. First of all, v'haya means Baba Yoseh Yehei. As the Gemara tells us, the word v'haya means as it is. No shift, no weakness, right? Like the words of the Shema. They have to be as it is. In the same way, you'll be connected to the Eibishter. You'll be kodesh. Hava Yoseh Yehei. Stable kodesh. Umen sagt v'haya hu. And we use the word hu. Pshita, as an imevet, kein yirid nitzai. Not only will you not decline in your Yiddishkeit because you involved yourself with somebody else, but it's going to strengthen and bolster your own shlichus. It will be firmer than it was before. And likewise, there'll be a meaningful, firm, lasting, durable effect on the mekabel. That's what the pasuk says, and he will be. In the current state of this Yid, when you encounter that Yid, their whole Yiddishkeit is nistar, which is how we refer to the third person. Who is the third person? Nistar means you don't see it, it's hidden. That's his Yiddishkeit at that point, completely hidden, doesn't mean anything to him. There's no question that his Yiddishkeit is alive and well deep within him. Okay, Psakdin or Rambam as Yedid writes to the Rambam paskins lahalocha that every single Jew is committed to Judaism, wants to do what the Torah expects. But it's hidden. Who is the opposite of the word zeh, which is something you can point and say this is real. It's apparent. So what does the Jew who's encountered and influenced and inspired this other Yid achieve? The who becomes v'hoya. As in Nitzutz von Yiddishkeit, was Quinzachnem behelem, that powerful spark of Yiddishkeit, which is buried inside him, who hidden, so will become active and in a way of v'hoya, with durability, with sustainability, without wavering. Von dem Zirf Shem Havai Shebechei Shvat nennt man aros noch Eiro Ikris and Avodah von Yosef Havai Liben Acher, and this combination of the Eibishter's name as it relates to Shvat gives us another more profound lesson about this Avodah that we're doing to bring back the Acher to become a Ben. Says there are those people who come with an argument, actually a complaint. Man bringt ihm rein in dem Ort, wo der Tor gefindt sich, und jeder bleibt dort. So if you're engaging with a person and bringing him into your space, and he stays in your space, surrounded by Torah and davening, inside the cloud of Kedusha, we get it. You enrolled him in a yeshiva, great, you've done well, makes sense. You can see clearly that you took somebody who was in a spiritual state of acher, and you turned him into the Eibishter's child. But what does it benefit a Jew that in the middle of nowhere you put on tefillin with him? Or any other mitzvah, once, you bench Lulav Esrog with him. And he's now going to go back into his assimilated environment. So what's the value if he goes back to where he came from and he doesn't enter the holy cloud? That's what people complain. What they're missing is that the emes is aber hefech of emes from Torah. The truth as designated by Torah is the exact opposite. Und sagt im Bor beTorah dvar Hashem ze halacha. It's a clear psak halacha. Uvelashon hayad chazaka clearly stated in the Rambam. That every single Jew is required to see himself as if he's in the exact balance right now between positive and negative. And the whole world right now is in a perfect balance between positive and negative. And therefore also mitzvah achas, says the Rambam clearly, you do a single mitzvah that tips him and the whole world into the side of merit, bringing salvation to himself and the entire world. The Rambam says that, not some Chassidish Rebbe. And in addition to that, clear halachic ruling is that we also know every time a Jew does a mitzvah, it creates a bond, because that's where the word mitzvah comes from, between him and the Eibishter. Between the one fulfilling the mitzvah and the Eibishter instructed the mitzvah. As the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, that bond is eternal. In addition to which, mitzvah, because we're talking about getting a yid to do a mitzvah. The nature of a mitzvah, clearly stated as an halachic principle in the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, is mitzvah goreres mitzvah. That one mitzvah drags another or leads to another mitzvah. The mitzvah vet him gorezain to tonocha mitzvah. This single mitzvah will encourage him to do another mitzvah. And that vet gorezain nocha mitzvah, which will then lead to another mitzvah, and Hashem Torah mitzvahs, until eventually that person is completely committed to Torah mitzvahs. So, right, in the moment where you engage the Yid and to do the mitzvah with him, you are not able to see this transition to becoming holy. That's why we have to pay attention to the exact words out of the pasuk that were chosen to represent this tziruf Shem Havayim, relating to Chodesh Shvat, which is the message of Yosef Havayim ben Acher, Ha'amer Yimirenu v'Hayahu. The Rosh Tevis does not tell us the end of the story, that it becomes holy. It only tells us the story of what you do. You have an impact on this person. You bring out that hidden spark of Yiddishkeit within him. The lesson is clear. We have to do what we have to do, which is to introduce Kedusha into that environment. We have to do proper investment, even though that's going to be a temporary spiritual decline, and a temporary stepping out of your healthy, comfortable environment, to have an impact on a Jew who is spiritually disconnected. But what the results of our efforts will be, that we're not responsible for. We're responsible for actions, not for outcomes. Will that you immediately be inspired and impacted and become holy, or will it take some time? That is not a deal breaker for our shlichus. In other words, the shlichus von Eden is tondi meise. Our shlichus is do what we have to do. Ufton. The outcome of what we do, the effect of what we do, that's the Eibishter's business. Of course, we're not excusing here that you can say, I touched a yid once, I'm done. My mitzvah, whether it's learning or doing a mitzvah, and now I could wipe my hands because I did what I had to do, right? It's just bad actions. Every opportunity that presents for us to connect with this Yid is an opportunity that we have to take to ignite his soul. As the Torah told us in regards to other mitzvahs, sometimes you have to repeat the same thing again and again and again until we are so effective that he becomes a self-sustaining light that can share light with others as well. Die Kavona is, als ich in der Fall, wenn man trefft Aiden, beises man, sieht man nur am Möglichkeitston mit dem man ein einziger Meister Mitzvah. Simultaneously, the message is, if we encounter a Yid, and the way things appear, we can only do a one-time Mitzvah with him. Warum base nicht, oi, und wenn wird ihm sehen noch einmal, because I don't know if I will or when I will see him again. Dafür danke für kol yechelte bis man seh, und das ist sein Schlichus Amer Yemeren Vo Yehu. You have to do everything in your power, and this is your responsibility at this moment, and the Rebbe will take care of the rest. Kol is negea b'miyuchad l'derei nezeh u'lizman zeh. As true as this is at any time in history, it's particularly relevant for us. Because because the month of Shvat has huge Shvat, which is the outside the Yom Hilula of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And very often that falls in proximity to Parshas Beshalach. As the Alter Rebbe tells us, on the day of a tzaddik's passing, all of the investment of his avodah and his achievements, inspiration, impact, all comes together. And on the day of the Yortzad, that all radiates back down into this world and empowers us. So this avodah that Yosef represents, taking the disconnected Yid and turning him back into the Eibish's child, was a core theme of what the Frierdiker Rebbe did. The Yosef Shebedorenu can be Shmei Horishan. And, not surprisingly, the Frierdiker Rebbe's name is the same name, Yosef. The Frierdiker Rebbe literally sacrificed everything, including his own well-being, to succeed in doing this. And the Frierdiker Rebbe then dispatched Shluchim, who also risked their lives in order to bring Yidden back. To the extent that even those Shluchim appointed their own Shluchim. As a result of which there are these shluchim of the Frierdiker Rebbe, meaning the shluchim of the Rebbe, all over the world, bringing Yidden back. And because we're doing this empowered by the Nasi Hadar, which has a name Yosef. It's Yosef as in Zeivet Nitchasron Ken Yerida b'Madrigosam. If you're riding on the shoulders of the Rebbe, you're not going to chas v'shalom falter spiritually because you're doing this avodah. No, adrabah, to the contrary. As the Alter Rebbe tells us, by engaging another Yid and inspiring another Yid, your own mind and heart becomes 1,000 times clearer. And that impact on this person who was so distant that he becomes a Baal Tshuva, and as we know, Baal Tshuva supersedes even where a perfect tzaddik could reach. But the shluchim also get elevated in that way as a result. But kol zeh in the meifim von Yitzchak, and all of that done with the name Yitzchak, which is the second name of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Chosem Shmei de Balei Lula, or Schoig v'Simcha v'Tuv Leiva, which implies tremendous simcha, and as we know, that David gave tremendous brachas to Yitzchak, tremendous brachas should come to all the shluchim as well. That then places us all in the Eibish's army, as that assembles this massive, powerful Jewish army that, just like in Mitzrayim, was able to leave with an outstretched, powerful arm, and with confidence, and in a very public fashion. The Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu, and that will happen with the coming of Mashiach. Vas Mashiach Osi Lasav Tzadikai B'Tiyufta, where Mashiach will bring even tzaddikim to experience tshuva, in this case through the effects on other people to turn them into Balei Tshuva, B'Gula or Amitis Ve'Hashlema, with the ultimate Gula with Mashiach that should happen mamish right now.